Okay, so here's what actually happened over the course of this trade war that nobody in Washington is willing to say out loud, but that the data, the markets, the diplomatic record, and the behavior of every country watching this conflict makes unmistakably clear. The United States has lost. Not temporarily, not in a way that a course correction can reverse quickly, not in a way that can be reframed with better messaging or a different spokesperson. Lost. Canada rejected American dominance over its economic future, and the rejection has stuck. Mark Carney came into this conflict as a technocrat that everyone in Washington dismissed. And he leaves this phase of it as the leader who stood up to the most powerful economy in the world, refused to bend, built real alternatives, and watched as the country that was supposed to have all the leverage discovered that leverage requires the other side to have no options. Canada had options. Carney built them. And Donald Trump, the man who has made dominance his entire brand, who has spent his entire political career convincing people that he never loses, is standing on the other side of this conflict, holding a set of tariffs that have not produced the capitulation he demanded, a set of legal cases that trade lawyers say he will lose, and a domestic political situation in which his own Republican senators are quietly telling him the trade war is costing too much. Trump is not in control of this situation. He has not been in control of it for some time. Carney is. Carney has been. And the entire watching world, every government, every market, every analyst who has been tracking the arc of this conflict has noticed exactly that. The narrative of American power and Canadian vulnerability that the Trump administration started this trade war with has been replaced by the observable reality of Canadian resilience and American frustration. That replacement did not happen by accident. It happened because of decisions that Carney made and strategies that he executed with a discipline and a patience that Washington completely failed to anticipate. Let me tell you exactly what Canadian rejection of American dominance looks like in concrete, specific, measurable terms, because I think it is important to be precise about what has actually been achieved here, rather than just speaking in the abstract language of leverage and sovereignty. Canadian energy exports to American markets are being systematically redirected toward Asian buyers. Not slowly, not as a long-term future plan. Right now, in real time, with real contracts signed and real infrastructure operational, the pipeline capacity that moves Canadian energy to Pacific Coast terminals for export to Japan, South Korea, and China is being used. The long-term LNG contracts that Carney's government helped broker with Asian buyers are being fulfilled. And the American markets that used to absorb Canadian energy on terms favorable to American buyers are finding that Canadian producers have alternatives and are using them. Canadian critical minerals, the lithium, the cobalt, the rare earth elements that American technology companies and American weapons manufacturers depend on, are increasingly moving through processing agreements with European partners rather than through American facilities. The Canadian government helped structure those agreements specifically to reduce Canadian dependency on American processing infrastructure, and that effort has succeeded in ways that have alarmed both the American technology sector and the American defense establishment. And Canadian lumber, which American construction companies have been relying on for decades, is finding new buyers in Asian markets at competitive prices, while American builders face cost increases that are showing up in housing project budgets from Texas to Ohio. This is not a paper victory that lives only in press releases and political speeches. These are real, structural, durable changes in how the Canadian economy is oriented that will persist regardless of what happens in Washington, regardless of which administration is in office after the next American election, and regardless of whether COSMA survives its July 2026 review in its current form or is renegotiated into something different. The changes Carney made to the Canadian economic architecture are not reversible on any short timeline. They are built into contracts, into infrastructure, into commercial relationships that have their own momentum and their own institutional weight. Let me tell you about what Trump powerless actually looks like from the inside of the American political system, because the picture that is emerging from Republican-aligned sources, from business community leaders, and from the market behavior of the last several weeks is genuinely remarkable. Trump cannot impose additional tariffs on Canada without causing measurable harm to American industries that his own political base depends on. He has already reached the point where tariff escalation would hurt Republican states more than it helps his political narrative. The governors of Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Montana, states with enormous and, in some cases, existential economic exposure to Canadian supply chains, Canadian energy, and Canadian inputs for their manufacturing sectors, have all communicated to the White House through various channels that the current level of economic disruption is politically sustainable for only so long, and that continued escalation is not sustainable at all without consequences that will be felt at the ballot box in exactly the states that matter most to Republican electoral survival. Additional escalation is not sustainable at all. Trump cannot win in international court. The trade lawyers have looked at the legal foundations of the Section 232 national security designations against Canada, the Section 301 unfair trade practice investigations, and the specific tariff regime that has been imposed. And their near unanimous verdict is that the United States will lose these cases at the WTO and in international arbitration. The only question is timeline. Trump cannot get Canada back to the table on his terms. Carney has been explicit and consistent about what the conditions for resuming substantive negotiations are. Remove the illegal tariffs, withdraw the legally indefensible investigations, acknowledge the violations, and Trump has not met those conditions. The table is there. The door is open. But the price of admission is admitting that he was wrong, and that is the one thing Donald Trump will not do. So the talks remain stalled, and the July 2026 deadline approaches. I want to talk about what Canada winning this phase of the trade war means for the long-term relationship between the United States and Canada, because this is the dimension of the story that gets the least attention, and that matters the most for understanding what comes after the immediate crisis. The conventional assumption about the American-Canadian relationship, an assumption that has governed Canadian foreign policy for decades, was that the asymmetry of size meant that Canada ultimately had to accommodate American preferences, even when those preferences were unreasonable. Canada was the smaller economy. Canada was the dependent partner. Canada was the country that in the final analysis could not afford a genuine confrontation with the United States because the cost of a permanent disruption in the relationship would be too high. Carney has proven that assumption wrong, not by accident, not by luck. By systematically building the economic infrastructure that gives Canada genuine alternatives to American market access. And the lesson that Canada's success teaches to every other country that has ever worried about being on the receiving end of American economic coercion, to every government that has wondered whether resistance is possible, and to the United States itself, is that the asymmetry of size does not automatically produce asymmetry of leverage. Size matters, but it is not the only thing that matters. Strategic patience matters. Leadership quality matters. The willingness to absorb short-term pain in exchange for long-term structural improvement matters, and the ability to build real alternatives before you need them. To have the exit infrastructure in place before you decide to use the exit matters most of all. Canada is a mid-sized democracy with 1/10 the population of the United States. It has just demonstrated that a mid-sized democracy with serious leadership and a clear strategic vision can protect its sovereignty against the most powerful economy in the world. That demonstration has been noticed by allies, by competitors, by every country that has ever been on the receiving end of American economic pressure and wondered whether resistance was possible. It is possible. Canada just proved it. Let me talk about the international implications of what Canada has done, because the ripple effects of Canada's successful resistance to American dominance extend far beyond North America. The European Union, which has been deepening its trade relationship with Canada throughout the period of the trade war, is drawing conclusions about what reliable partnership looks like in a world of American unpredictability. Canadian goods are flowing into European markets under frameworks that were specifically designed to reduce European exposure to American supply chain volatility. European industrial partners who now process Canadian minerals are building relationships with Canadian producers that will persist for decades, regardless of what happens to KSMA. The EU's conclusion from watching this conflict play out over months is clear, and it is being acted on. Canada is a reliable partner whose commitments can be trusted, whose governance meets European standards, and whose long-term trajectory is toward greater integration with the rules-based international order. America under this administration is not. That conclusion is not merely rhetorical. It is being translated into concrete policy decisions, trade agreement structures, investment frameworks, and regulatory alignment arrangements that are gradually but meaningfully reshaping the economic architecture of the North Atlantic in ways that will persist long after this particular American administration is gone. That conclusion is reshaping investment decisions, regulatory cooperation, and diplomatic alignment in ways that will be visible long after the immediate trade war has been resolved. Asian partners are drawing their own conclusions. Japan, South Korea, and the countries that have signed long-term energy and resource agreements with Canada have watched Canada demonstrate that it keeps its commitments even under enormous pressure. They have also watched the United States demonstrate that American commitments are contingent on political conditions that can change without notice. The contrast is not subtle. And in a world where trust is an economic asset and where the reliability of a partner's commitments has direct financial value, Canada's stock has risen and America's has fallen in ways that compound over time. And the countries most attentive to what has happened in this conflict are America's strategic competitors. China is watching a close American ally demonstrate that American economic coercion has structural limits that can be successfully resisted. Russia is watching the international coalition that the United States has been trying to build against it lose credibility as American unreliability becomes the dominant story of American foreign policy. And every country in the world that has a territorial dispute, a sanctions exposure, a trade tension, or a security concern involving the United States is watching what happened when Canada decided to push back and updating its assessment of American resolve, American reliability, and the actual limits of American economic power accordingly. The update is not favorable to Washington. The conclusion being drawn in capitals from Beijing to Brussels to Brasilia is that American economic dominance, while still real and still significant, is not as unassailable as it appeared before Canada demonstrated what determined resistance backed by real alternatives actually looks like. Now, let me be honest about what Canada winning this phase does not mean, because clarity about the limits of what has been achieved is as important as recognizing the achievement itself. Canada winning this phase of the trade war does not mean the trade war is over. The July 2026 COSMA review deadline is still approaching. The tariffs that the Trump administration has imposed are still in place. The legal cases are still working their way through international tribunals that operate on timelines measured in years rather than months. The economic disruption that both countries have absorbed, the supply chain disruptions, the price increases, the investment uncertainty, the realigned commercial relationships is real and ongoing and will not disappear simply because Canada has demonstrated it can outlast American pressure. What Canada winning this phase actually means in concrete, operational, forward-looking terms is that the terms on which this conflict eventually resolves will be substantially shaped by Canada's conditions rather than America's demands. Canada has moved the Overton window of what a resolution looks like. The starting point for any eventual negotiation is now much closer to Canada's publicly stated conditions than it was when this trade war began. It means that when CUSMA is renegotiated, and it will be renegotiated because both countries ultimately need a functioning trade framework, regardless of the political drama around it, Canada will negotiate from a position of demonstrated strength rather than demonstrated dependence. It means that the future Canadian government that sits across the table from whatever American administration comes next will have a track record of successful resistance to draw on an alternative economic architecture to point to and a set of international relationships that give Canada genuine options if American terms are unacceptable. If you are Canadian watching this, this is what your Prime Minister built while Washington was busy congratulating itself on its toughness. He built Canada a future in which the American relationship, however important it remains, is a choice rather than a compulsion. If you are American watching this, your government spent months trying to force Canada to accept terms that Canada found unacceptable and failed. The cost of that failure is being distributed across your economy and higher prices, disrupted supply chains, and a strategic position in North America that is weaker than it was before any of this started. Trump powerless, Canada standing.